At the family dinner, the room buzzed with laughter and wine glasses clinking. She sat at the far end of the long table, wearing the only dress she could afford, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Then, out of nowhere, he raised his glass, smirked, and called her a poor, fat pig. The table fell silent for a second, then erupted into cruel laughter. One cousin covered his mouth, trying not to spit out his drink. His sister whispered, "She really doesn't belong here." Someone else snapped a photo as he leaned back in his chair, proud of his joke. Her face burned as dozens of eyes turned to her. She forced a brittle smile, blinking back tears as the humiliation washed over her in waves. Not a single person defended her. Even the waiters froze awkwardly. She stayed quiet that night. No outbursts, no dramatic exits. Just quiet, searing pain. Everyone thought she would go home and cry. But later that night, at a high-profile corporate gala, the entire room would see a different side of her. Cameras flashed. His father's face turned ghost white. And in one breathtaking moment, the woman they mocked was revealed as the billionaire who bought their company. This is the story of one brutal insult, a night she'll never forget, and a twist that silenced them all. What do you think happened next? Hello, family. Welcome back. Before we begin, I have a small but heartfelt request. Please subscribe. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. Every time you click that button, you're helping us share voices that would otherwise be forgotten and stories that deserve to be heard. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from, because together, we are not just telling stories, we are keeping hope alive. Chandeliers sparkled above the long glass table, casting warm light on silver cutlery and tall wine glasses. The air buzzed with the kind of laughter that wasn't really kind, sharp, echoing, full of pride. Claire Thompson sat quietly at the far end of the table, her hands folded in her lap. Her dress was simple, pale blue, clean, but modest. It wasn't the designer brand her mother-in-law preferred. Her shoes were the same pair she'd worn to last year's family dinner. Across the table, Ryan's voice carried over the chatter, loud and confident. He was telling another story about a deal he supposedly closed. The waiters smiled politely, refilling glasses. Everyone was performing, pretending, playing parts. Claire didn't fit in, and she knew it. She wasn't trying to. Ryan's mother, Margaret, leaned forward, eyes sharp as ever. "Claire, dear, did you finally do something with your hair?" Claire offered a small smile. "Just washed it, Mrs. Thompson." Margaret chuckled. "Well, it looks better. I told Ryan you needed a stylist. Appearances matter, especially for a Thompson." Edward, Ryan's father, gave a low grunt of agreement without looking up from his steak. "It's not just about looks, Margaret. It's about presence. Some people just don't have it." The jab landed. Claire caught it but said nothing. She took a sip of her water, eyes on her plate. Ryan laughed. "Oh, come on, Dad. Claire's got presence, like a librarian no one listens to." Laughter rippled around the table. Claire smiled politely again, that small, practiced smile she wore like armor. Evelyn, sitting beside her, shifted uncomfortably. She wasn't part of the family, just a +1 invited to fill a seat. She squeezed Claire's hand under the table, whispering, "Breathe." Claire did, slowly, deeply. Ryan leaned back in his chair, draping an arm behind Vanessa, his secretary, who'd somehow found her way to the dinner as his assistant. Everyone pretended not to notice. "So, Claire," Ryan said loudly, "what did you do all day?" "Bake something. Watch those little motivational videos again." A few cousins snickered. Claire's throat tightened, but she spoke softly, steady. "I was working on a few things." Ryan smirked. "Working on what?" "Laundry." The laughter hit again, louder this time. Margaret clinked her glass. Ryan, stop teasing your wife. She's sensitive. Ryan grinned, unbothered. Sensitive? Mum, she's a marshmallow. You poke her once, and she melts. Evelyn turned sharply. That's not funny. Ryan looked at her. Relax, Evelyn. We're just joking. Claire knows I love her. He reached over and patted Claire's cheek, not gently. The gesture felt like ownership, not affection. Then he stood, raising his glass. All right, everyone, he said, voice booming. Before we dig into dessert, I'd like to make a toast. Claire's stomach sank. Here we go, Evelyn muttered. Ryan's grin widened. To my wife, he began, living proof that love is charity. A few gasps. Then laughter. Hesitant at first, then growing. He wasn't done. She eats like a queen, he added, swirling his wine, but somehow still looks like a poor, fat pig. The table exploded with laughter. Even Margaret chuckled into her napkin. One cousin covered his mouth to stop wine from spilling. Someone else actually clapped. Evelyn's eyes went wide. Ryan, she hissed. But the room was already echoing with the sound of mockery, laughter, whispers, the clinking of glasses. Claire froze. The sound blurred. The laughter echoed around her like waves, each one crashing harder. Her face burned. Her throat tightened, but she wouldn't give them tears. Not tonight. She looked at Ryan, at the man who once promised her forever, and smiled faintly. It wasn't real, but it was steady. Good one, she said softly, her voice trembling only slightly. Ryan laughed louder, proud of himself. See? She gets it. Evelyn reached for her hand again, whispering, Claire, we can leave. We don't have to stay. Claire shook her head. No. Let him finish. She sat there until the laughter faded into new conversations. People went back to their meals. The moment, for everyone else, was over. But for her, it had only just begun. When dinner ended, Ryan grabbed her coat from the waiter, or rather, tossed it at her. Come on, sweetheart, he said. Don't sulk. You looked miserable all night. I wasn't miserable, she said quietly. I was thinking. About what? Your next shopping list? He laughed and walked ahead. Evelyn caught Claire's arm before she followed. You don't deserve this, she whispered. I know, Claire said softly. But he'll know too. One day, the night air outside was cool. The black car waited at the curb, the driver already holding the door open. Ryan slid into the back seat first, still half smiling, scrolling through his phone. As soon as the door shut, his tone changed. Don't start, he said sharply without looking up. You embarrassed me in there. Claire blinked. I didn't say a word. That's the point. You just sat there like a ghost. Everyone noticed. I didn't want to make a scene, she said quietly. You could have laughed, or said something playful. Instead, you just froze. It made me look bad. Claire stared out the window. The streetlights blurred by. You made yourself look bad, Ryan. His head snapped toward her. What did you say? Nothing. Yeah, that's what I thought. He leaned back, muttering, God, sometimes I wonder why I even try. You're lucky I take you anywhere. She said nothing. The silence grew heavy. Ryan scrolled through his phone again, smirking at something. Claire caught a glimpse of a message from Vanessa. You were hilarious tonight. He chuckled under his breath. She gets my humor. You should take notes. Claire didn't answer. Her eyes stayed on the window, her reflection pale and calm. The car slowed as Edward's voice came from the front seat. He was on the phone, speaking low but urgent. Yes, I got the documents, he said. Tomorrow night, right? The acquisition deal. Who's the investor again? A pause. Silverline Ventures, he said, finally nodding. Never heard of them. Claire's fingers tightened on her lap. Her eyes flickered for just a second, sharp, alert. Silverline Ventures. Her company. Her real life. The one she built before Ryan decided to break her piece by piece. Edward continued talking. As long as they save us from this bankruptcy mess, I don't care who they are. The word bankruptcy hit Ryan like a slap. What bankruptcy? He demanded. Edward hung up. It's business, son. Nothing you need to worry about, Dad, Ryan said, frowning. Are we broke? Edward gave a forced chuckle. Of course not. It's just a negotiation. But Claire saw the sweat on his neck, the stiffness in his shoulders. She saw everything. She looked at him for a moment, not as her father-in-law, but as the man who would soon answer to her. She turned back to the window, her reflection framed by the glow of city lights. Her eyes, once full of pain, were calm now. Cold. Ryan was still talking. Something about his new car, a weekend trip, another joke about her weight. She wasn't listening anymore. All she could hear was Edward's voice echoing in her head. Silverline Ventures tomorrow night. The acquisition deal. Her heart beat slow and steady. Let them laugh, she thought. Let them mock, insult, and look down on me. Because tomorrow their world would shift, and they wouldn't even see it coming. The car pulled up to their mansion. Ryan got out first, slamming the door. Try not to look so miserable next time, all right? People might think I'm torturing you or something. He laughed at his own joke and walked inside. Claire stayed in the car for a moment, watching his shadow disappear through the doorway. She exhaled softly, a long breath she'd been holding for years. Then she whispered to her reflection in the window, voice calm, quiet, and certain. Let them laugh, she said. They'll choke on it soon enough. If you haven't subscribed yet, we'd love for you to join our community by hitting the subscribe button. Through our stories, we build hope and give a future to children and women who have been abused all over the world. Motivate us by subscribing and turning on your notification bell so you never miss a story that matters. Also, let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from, and how did this story speak to you? The next morning, sunlight streamed through the wide bedroom windows, hitting the silk curtains and the edge of the king-size bed. The mansion was quiet, except for the faint sound of Ryan's phone buzzing on the nightstand. Claire lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She hadn't really slept. The dinner replayed in her mind, the laughter, the whispers, the word pig echoing like a bell she couldn't unhear, but under the sting of humiliation, something else had woken up inside her. Something that had been asleep for a long time. Ryan stirred beside her, snoring lightly. His face looked peaceful, almost boyish. Funny, she thought. Cruel people always looked innocent when they slept. The phone buzzed again. A new message. She turned her head slightly and saw the preview flash across the screen. Vanessa. Morning, handsome. Miss you already. Claire didn't flinch. Not anymore. She just watched the screen fade to black. Downstairs, the housekeeper was setting breakfast when Claire walked into the kitchen. She tied her hair back, poured herself some coffee, and stood quietly by the window. Ryan walked in minutes later, his tie half done, phone pressed to his ear. Yeah, tell the driver to be ready by 9, he said sharply. No, not the black car, the silver one. I don't want to look like a politician. He glanced at her between sentences. Morning, he said, tone flat. Morning. Don't forget we're having dinner with the Palmers tonight. Wear something simple. Simple? You know what I mean. Not one of those cheap floral things you like. Something elegant, but not loud. You stand next to me, not in front. He hung up and grabbed a piece of toast. By the way, he added, mouth full, Vanessa's coming with me to the office today. We're going over some client reports. Claire sipped her coffee. Of course. Ryan glanced at her suspiciously. Don't start, okay? You get weird every time I mention her. I'm not weird, she said softly. I just listen. He smirked. Well, stop listening so much. It's not attractive. And just like that he was gone. The door closed. The sound of his car faded down the driveway. Claire set her cup down, steady hands, calm eyes. Then she pulled her phone from her robe pocket and pressed a contact labeled E. The line clicked. You up early? Evelyn's voice came through, warm and teasing. Claire's tone was steady. I'm ready. For what? Evelyn asked, though she already knew. For everything. The screen on Claire's desk lit up, displaying a clean, modern logo, Silverline Ventures. The name had started as a joke. Years ago, when she and Evelyn were broke 20-somethings sharing a tiny apartment, Evelyn had said, You always look for the silver lining, even when life hits hard. Claire had smiled then and said, Then maybe that's what I'll call my company someday. And she did. Before Ryan. Before the mansion. Before she'd learned what cruelty looked like behind closed doors. Back then, she was just Claire Bennett, a data analyst with a mind for numbers and a dream to build something real. She'd met Evelyn during a business seminar. They clicked instantly, two women with the same hunger to create, the same frustration with being ignored by men who thought they were too emotional for business. Together, they built Silverline Ventures. It started small, analytics for small businesses, software investments, quiet partnerships. Within 5 years, it was worth millions. They were partners in every sense, brains, trust, friendship. Then Ryan came along. He was charming, smooth, confident. He made her laugh, made her feel noticed after years of being invisible. He called her brilliant until the day they married. Then suddenly, he called her overly ambitious, distracted, too focused on work. When he found out about Silverline Ventures, he laughed. You? Running a company? Claire, come on. That's adorable. She remembered that night vividly. They were sitting in the living room, a glass of wine in his hand, papers on her lap. He glanced at them and scoffed. Baby, you don't have to pretend anymore, he said. You married into real success. Leave the business stuff to the pros. You mean men like you? She asked quietly. Exactly, he said, missing the insult entirely. It's cute you tried, though. The next week, he suggested she sell her shares and quit. She didn't argue. She just smiled and told him she would. But she didn't. Instead, she transferred her shares to Evelyn, who held them in trust. Her name vanished from every legal document. But her power, her influence, never left. Ryan thought she was just his stay-at-home wife. The truth? Every morning after he left, she slipped into her home office, turned on her encrypted laptop, and ran one of the fastest-growing investment firms in the country. Quietly, efficiently, invisibly. That afternoon, she was in that same office, hair tied back, glasses on, fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. Her screen showed graphs, figures, and stock projections. Her phone buzzed again, a video call from Evelyn. Morning, boss lady, Evelyn said with a grin. Behind her was the sleek downtown office of Silverline Ventures. How's life in the castle? Claire smirked. Still a circus. Ryan being Ryan. Worse. He compared me to Vanessa again. Evelyn rolled her eyes. Vanessa? The secretary who dresses like a perfume ad. That's the one. What did he say this time? Claire imitated his tone perfectly. You could learn something from Vanessa. She knows how to look like she belongs in a room. Evelyn groaned. Ugh. The man's a walking cliché. Claire smiled faintly. He's consistent. I'll give him that. Evelyn leaned forward. So, are you ready for this week? We closed the Thompson acquisition on Friday. Edward signed the preliminary papers yesterday. Claire's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. And Ryan still doesn't know? Not a clue, Evelyn said. He's probably still bragging about his family's fortune. Claire let out a quiet breath. Evelyn, you're sure this is the right move? Evelyn nodded. Claire, they mocked you. They broke you down for years. You don't owe them softness. You owe yourself peace. Claire's gaze dropped. I didn't start this to win, Evelyn. Then why? She looked straight into the camera. I started this to end it. Evelyn nodded slowly. Then let's end it. Hours later, Claire stood in the laundry room folding Ryan's shirts. The silence in the mansion was heavy, the only sound the soft hum of the dryer. She picked up one of his white dress shirts, neatly pressed, expensive fabric. The faint scent of cologne lingered on it, but beneath it was something else, a trace of perfume that wasn't hers. Sweet, cheap, floral. Vanessa's. For a moment she just stared at the shirt, not angry, not sad, just done. She folded it carefully, placed it on top of the others, and smiled, a small, knowing smile that didn't reach her eyes. That night, Ryan came home late, laughing into his phone as he walked through the door. Yeah, she totally believed I was working late, he said, chuckling. You're too good, Vanessa. See you tomorrow. He hung up and turned to Claire, who was sitting at the dining table sorting through papers. Still awake? He asked. You didn't have to wait up. She looked at him calmly. I wasn't waiting. He raised a brow. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, she said simply. Just not waiting. He stared at her for a moment, confused. Whatever. Don't forget, the gala's this weekend. My parents want us to look perfect. Try not to wear that old dress again. She nodded slowly. Of course. He smirked, satisfied, and walked upstairs. When she heard his footsteps fade, she whispered to the empty room. Enjoy it while it lasts. Her phone lit up beside her. A text from Evelyn. Contract signed. We own Thompson Holdings as of Friday morning. Claire stared at the message for a long moment, then turned off her phone and whispered into the dark. He has no idea what's coming. She stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the city. The same city that once ignored her, belittled her, and laughed at her dreams. Now it was hers, and soon, the man who mocked her would finally understand what it meant to be small. The ballroom shimmered under golden chandeliers. Music drifted softly through the air, slow, elegant, expensive. Waiters glided between tables carrying champagne glasses that sparkled under the light. Reporters hovered near the entrance, snapping photos as black cars pulled up one after another. The banners hanging above the stage read, A New Era, Silverline Ventures, ex-Thompson Holdings. It was the biggest corporate event of the year, a merger celebration disguised as a social parade. For most people, it was just another gala. For Claire, it was Judgment Day. Ryan and his father, Edward, arrived first. Cameras flashed as they stepped out of their car. Ryan wore a crisp black tuxedo, his hair slicked back. Beside him, Vanessa, his secretary, shimmered in a tight red dress. Reporters leaned in. Mr. Thompson, who's your guest tonight? Ryan grinned. My assistant. Couldn't do business without her. Vanessa giggled, pretending to be shy. Inside, Edward greeted investors, smiling stiffly. His handshake was firm, but his eyes carried exhaustion. The company had been on the verge of collapse for months, and this merger, this mysterious acquisition, had saved him. But deep down, he didn't trust anything he couldn't control. He scanned the crowd, his thoughts distant. The name Silverline Ventures played in his head like an echo. He had done his research, or tried to. The company was nearly invisible. No public. CEO, no press interviews, only a few quiet board members. It was like a ghost empire. And somehow, that ghost owned his family now. Claire arrived 20 minutes later. Her car stopped quietly at the side entrance. No reporters, no flashbulbs, no red carpet. Just her, calm, radiant, and dressed in a dark emerald gown that shimmered only when the light caught it. Her makeup was soft, her hair swept into a low chignon. She wore no flashy jewelry, except for a thin silver bracelet. The first gift she'd ever bought herself after Silverline turned a profit. As she entered, heads turned. She didn't stride like she owned the place. She simply moved with quiet confidence, graceful, unhurried. Ryan saw her across the room and groaned. Finally, he muttered. She actually showed up. Vanessa leaned toward him. She looks different tonight. Ryan smirked. Please, she's trying too hard. Watch, she'll probably trip on her heels before dessert. When Claire reached their table, Ryan didn't even stand. Took you long enough, he said, sipping his drink. Try not to embarrass me tonight, all right? Claire smiled politely. I'll do my best. Her voice was calm. Too calm. Edward glanced at her. For the first time that evening, something flickered in his eyes. Confusion, then realization. He studied her face, her poise, the way she glanced at the stage and the sponsor's banner. He'd seen that expression before, not at a dinner, but in a boardroom. Recognition dawned. He knew, but he said nothing. Not yet. Dinner began. Waiters served steak and wine, conversations flowing around the table. Ryan, of course, dominated the moment. Loud, charming, confident. So, Vanessa, he said, leaning close to her, I was just telling Dad about that spreadsheet you built for the marketing pitch. She's a genius with numbers. Vanessa smiled, pretending modesty. Just doing my job. Ryan turned toward Claire. Remember when you tried to help me with finances, honey? You messed up the formulas so bad the accountant called it a crime against Excel. The table laughed. Claire didn't. She just cut her steak slowly, one precise motion at a time. Edward cleared his throat. Ryan, maybe enough jokes for tonight. Ryan chuckled. Relax, Dad. She's used to it. Aren't you, babe? Claire looked up at him. Her eyes were cool, unreadable. Used to it, yes. Amused by it? No. Ryan blinked. The tone, calm, sharp, controlled, caught him off guard. Vanessa giggled awkwardly. You two are so funny. Claire turned to her. You think so? Totally, Vanessa said, smiling nervously. Good, Claire replied softly. You'll need your sense of humor before the night's over. Edward's fork froze mid-air. He leaned closer to Ryan. Don't say another word, he whispered. Ryan frowned. What's your problem? Edward's voice was low. Just stop. Ryan laughed quietly. Dad, come on. I'm just teasing. She's fine. Edward didn't answer. His gaze stayed on Claire, who now seemed entirely at ease. Too at ease for a woman being mocked in front of an audience. Something was coming. He could feel it. As dessert plates were cleared, the music shifted. The MC walked onto the stage, microphone in hand, smiling wide. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, tonight we celebrate a monumental partnership, the acquisition of Thompson Holdings by the visionary team at Silverline Ventures. Applause filled the room. Ryan clapped loudly, grinning. Vanessa leaned in, whispering, Do we know who this Silverline person is? Ryan shrugged. Some rich geek with too much money. Who cares? They just saved our family. Edward said nothing. His face was pale, eyes locked on the MC. The man continued, voice booming. And now, it's my honor to introduce the CEO of Silverline Ventures, the woman behind this historic deal. The lights dimmed, a single spotlight turned toward the side of the stage, and there she was, Claire. Every head turned, murmurs swept through the room, cameras flashed like lightning. Ryan froze, his fork slipping from his hand. Edward didn't move. He just whispered, Oh my God! Vanessa's mouth dropped open. Wait, is that... Ryan forced a laugh. No way! This is some kind of joke, right? The host gestured toward her. Please welcome Mrs. Claire Thompson. The room erupted in applause, confused, hesitant, disbelieving applause. Claire stepped onto the stage with steady steps, her expression calm and professional. The microphone gleamed in her hand as she smiled politely at the audience. "Good evening," she began. Her voice was smooth, confident, echoing across the silent ballroom. "It's an honor to stand before you tonight. Silverline Ventures has spent years investing in innovation, in people, in potential, sometimes even where others failed to see it." Her eyes scanned the crowd, and then found Ryan. He looked stunned, color draining from his face. Claire's tone shifted slightly, still polite, but sharper now. "When we look at companies like Thomson Holdings, we see history. We see families. We see the lessons that built them. And sometimes, the lessons they forgot." A ripple moved through the room. Edward bowed his head slightly, unable to meet her eyes. Claire smiled faintly. "And to my husband," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Thank you for teaching me what not to settle for." A gasp spread across the hall. Cameras flashed like wildfire. Ryan jumped up from his chair. "This isn't funny, Claire," he shouted. "Tell them you're joking." Claire tilted her head. "Do I look like I'm joking, Ryan?" He stared at her, panic rising. You can't be the CEO. You quit that stupid company years ago." She stepped closer to the edge of the stage, eyes locked on him. "That's what you thought." Vanessa tried to whisper something to him, but he waved her off, face red, hands shaking. The MC, sensing the drama, tried to smooth things over. "Let's, give another round of applause for Mrs. Thompson." But the audience wasn't clapping. They were watching, every eye on Ryan, every camera recording. Ryan turned to his father, desperate. "Dad, do something." Edward's voice was quiet. "I told you to stop talking." Ryan's face twisted. "You knew?" Edward sighed, his tone hollow. "I knew. Tonight." Ryan looked back at Claire, his words stumbling. "You set me up." "You humiliated me in front of everyone," Claire smiled slightly. "No, Ryan. You did that all by yourself. I just stopped cleaning up after you," the crowd murmured. Reporters whispered to each other, snapping photos. Claire turned back to the microphone. "To everyone here, I look forward to building a better, stronger future for Thomson Holdings. A future where dignity and respect are valued more than ego and greed." Then she looked straight at Ryan one last time. "You taught me how to fight, Ryan. You just never imagined I'd win." Applause burst out, genuine this time, loud and echoing. Ryan stood there, stunned, before storming out of the ballroom, Vanessa scrambling after him. Edward stayed seated, eyes low, realization heavy on his face. Claire stepped off the stage, handing the microphone to the MC. Evelyn met her near the back, eyes wide with pride. "You did it," Evelyn whispered. Claire exhaled slowly, calm and controlled. "No," she said. "It's only the beginning." At the far end of the ballroom, the cameras continued to flash, catching Edward's empty stare and the vacant chair beside him. And in the quiet space between applause and whispers, one truth hung heavy in the air. The woman they mocked, ignored and humiliated had just become their boss. The night of the gala would be remembered for years. The story of the mocked wife who owned. It all spread like wildfire. By morning, every major news outlet had the same headline. Claire Thompson, CEO of Silverline Ventures, shocks industry by acquiring her husband's family company. And underneath it, a photo of Ryan's stunned face at the gala, mouth open, humiliation frozen forever in pixels. The video of him calling her a poor, fat pig during that infamous family dinner resurfaced next, leaked anonymously online. No one knew who had shared it, but everyone knew who benefited from it. Within 24 hours, the internet had chosen its hero and its villain. Claire became a symbol, the woman who rose from ridicule to power. Ryan became a meme. Clips of his cruel jokes circulated with captions like "Karma in heels" and "Guess who's broke now?" He tried to deny the video, claiming it was edited, but the damage was done. Sponsors pulled back. Friends stopped returning his calls. The same people who used to laugh at Claire's expense now laughed at him. At Thompson Holdings, everything changed. Edward called an emergency board meeting 3 days later. His face was drawn, his voice hollow. "I'm stepping down," he announced. "Effective immediately. Claire will assume full control as CEO." The room buzzed with murmurs. "She's the majority shareholder," Edward continued. "This is the only way to protect the company's future." He looked across the table at Claire, his expression a mix of defeat and reluctant respect. "You won," he said quietly. "You played the game better than any of us." Claire met his eyes calmly. "It was never a game to me, Edward. It was survival." He nodded once, then stood and left the room without another word. Ryan didn't take it well. He showed up at her office the next day, disheveled, angry, and desperate. "Claire," he barked, slamming the door behind him. "What the hell did you do?" "You made me a joke." She didn't look up from her papers. "No, Ryan. You made yourself a joke. I just let people see it." He paced the room, fuming. "I can fix this. We can do interviews. Tell people it was all part of some misunderstanding. We'll say the deal was mutual." Claire looked up, her expression unreadable. "You think this is about PR? It's about reputation," he shouted. "No," she said softly, standing now. "It's about respect." "Something you never gave me," he laughed bitterly. "You think anyone's going to respect you? You humiliated your husband in public." "Correction," she said evenly. "I revealed the truth in public. You did the humiliating all by yourself." He clenched his fists. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Claire tilted her head. "No, Ryan. I'm just done pretending it doesn't hurt." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the air thick with years of resentment. Then Ryan scoffed and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. By the weekend, his life began to unravel. Vanessa, his beloved secretary, stopped answering his calls. When he finally reached her, she sounded cold. "Ryan," she said flatly, "I can't be seen with you right now. The company's under her control, and everyone's talking. It's bad for my image." "Your image?" he said, voice cracking. "I lost everything because of you." "Because of me?" She laughed. "No, you lost everything because you couldn't keep your mouth shut." The line went dead. Ryan hurled his phone across the room. It hit the wall and shattered. Meanwhile, Margaret Thompson made her move. She showed up unannounced at Claire's office, her designer heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Claire was reviewing reports with Evelyn when the receptionist buzzed her. "She insists it's urgent," the receptionist whispered. "Send her in," Claire said quietly. Margaret swept into the office like a storm, flawless makeup, cold smile. "Claire, dear," she began, sitting without being invited. "I came to talk about my son." Claire leaned back, expression calm. "Of course you did." Margaret folded her hands. "You've made your point. You've punished him enough. The video, the press, it's everywhere. But destroying him won't heal you." Claire's gaze stayed steady. "You think this is about revenge?" Margaret smiled thinly. "It's always about revenge with women like you." "Women like me?" Claire repeated softly. "Yes," Margaret said. "Emotional, vindictive, unable to move on." Claire stood and walked slowly to the window, looking out over the city skyline. "You're wrong," she said finally. "I'm not destroying his life, Margaret." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "No?" Claire turned to face her, voice cool as glass. "I'm freeing mine, after years of them." The older woman stiffened. "I used to think silence was strength," Claire continued. "That if I stayed calm, things would get better. But silence only feeds bullies. So I stopped being silent." Margaret stood abruptly, her composure cracking for the first time. "You'll regret this." "No," Claire said. He will. Margaret stormed out. Evelyn exhaled. That woman's ice. Claire smiled faintly. She melts just like everyone else when the truth burns long enough. The tabloids had a field day when Claire filed for divorce. From mocked wife to billionaire boss. Claire Thompson ends marriage, keeps empire. Ryan Thompson, the husband who laughed too soon. Her photo was everywhere. Magazines, TV segments, social media feeds. She didn't grant interviews. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than any statement. Evelyn handled the press, fielding calls while Claire focused on work. Together, they restructured Thompson Holdings from the inside out. They fired corrupt executives, promoted hard-working employees, and introduced programs that supported women in leadership. When one reporter asked why she cared so much about female empowerment, Claire answered simply, "Because I know what it feels like to have a voice no one listens to." Her words went viral. 1 week later, she met with Edward for the last time. He looked older now, smaller somehow. "You've done what you came to do," he said. "You've proven your point. What happens now?" Claire studied him for a moment. "Now, we rebuild. But differently." He nodded slowly. "I underestimated you." "Most people did," she said gently. "That's how I won." He managed a sad smile. "Take care of the company. It deserves better than what we gave it." "I intend to," she replied. He stood, hesitated, then extended his hand. She shook it. No bitterness, just closure.
A single piece of paper should have been her vindication. For a pregnant Alice Hayes, the DNA test clutched in her trembling hand was the absolute truth, the legal key to securing her unborn child's future. But when she presented it in the hallowed halls of a Charleston family court, the only response she received was laughter. It was cold, cruel, and confident laughter from her husband's mistress, the immaculate Victoria Vance. The judge looked on a flicker of pity in his eyes, as a second test confirmed the impossible David Hayes, Alice's husband of 10 years, was not the father. Her world didn't just crack, it imploded. But what if the science itself was telling a lie? What if the deepest, most shocking betrayals are written not in our hearts, but in our very blood? The late afternoon sun, thick and golden, as honey streamed through the Palladian windows of the Hayes residence in Charleston's historic South of Broad neighborhood. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny, glittering secret. For Alice Hayes, this light had once been a symbol of warmth and clarity. Now it felt accusatory, exposing the fine cracks in the porcelain veneer of her life. At 38, she was 7 months pregnant with the child she and her husband David had yearned for, a small miracle after years of quiet heartache and sterile clinics. The nursery was painted a soft, hopeful shade of seafoam green. A handcrafted wooden mobile of celestial bodies bought on their last anniversary trip to Asheville hung over the crib, waiting for tiny eyes to gaze up at it. Everything was perfect. Except it was all a lie. David Hayes was a man sculpted from ambition and old Charleston money. He was a partner at a private equity firm, a world of crisp suits, hushed phone calls, and numbers that could alter the fates of companies. He moved with an easy confidence that Alice had once found intoxicating. He'd courted her with the same strategic precision he applied to a hostile takeover. Flowers every Tuesday, surprise weekend, getaways, whispered promises of a future as solid and grand as the antebellum homes surrounding them. She, a talented art historian who had put her career on hold, had believed him. She had built her entire world within the beautiful gilded cage of their marriage. The first crack appeared not as a dramatic fissure, but as a hairline fracture, almost invisible to the naked eye. It was the scent of a perfume that wasn't hers clinging to his suit jacket, a heady, expensive scent of tuberose and sandalwood. When she'd asked, he'd laughed it off. Victoria's, probably. We were crammed into a taxi after the merger dinner. The woman marinates in it. Victoria Vance. Her name spoken so casually landed like a stone in a tranquil pond. Victoria was David's newest partner at the firm, a fiercely intelligent woman with a razor-sharp wit and a wardrobe to match. Alice had met her a few times at corporate events. She was all sharp angles and predatory smiles, the kind of woman who didn't walk into a room so much as conquer it. Then came the late nights blamed on market volatility in Asia, the weekend trips for emergency meetings that left him looking exhausted but strangely energized, the way he angled his phone away from her, the screen going dark the moment she entered the room. Alice was not a fool, but she was a master of self-deception, an expert at papering over the cracks to preserve the beautiful facade. The baby, this precious, long-awaited child, was supposed to be the mortar that sealed their foundation forever. The illusion finally shattered on a rainy Tuesday. David had claimed to be in a late-night negotiation. Alice, unable to sleep, the baby kicking restlessly beneath her ribs, had driven to his office building downtown. His car, a sleek black Mercedes, was not in its designated spot in the parking garage. A cold dread, slick and oily, coated her throat. On a desperate whim, she drove past the Spectator, a chic, dimly lit hotel bar he and his colleagues sometimes frequented. And there it was. His car parked right outside. She didn't go in. She didn't need to. She sat in her own car across the street, the rain blurring the world outside her heart, hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. An hour later, they emerged. David and Victoria. They weren't talking business. His hand was resting possessively on the small of her back. As they paused under the hotel's awning, Victoria reached up, straightened his tie with an air of practiced intimacy, and then rose on her toes to kiss him. It wasn't a fleeting, friendly peck. It was a slow, deliberate kiss, a claim. David's hands came up to cup her face, pulling her closer. Alice felt the air leave her lungs in a silent scream. The world tilted the streetlights, smearing into abstract streaks of pain. She drove home in a daze, the sound of the windshield wipers mimicking the frantic, repetitive thought in her head, "It's real, it's real, it's real." When David came home hours later, smelling of rain, and that same tuberose perfume, she was waiting for him in the grand foyer, the single lamp, casting long, distorted shadows. "Alice, what are you doing up so late?" he asked, his voice a practiced melody of concern. "The Spectator," she said, her own voice sounding foreign, brittle. "How was the emergency meeting?" The practiced smile on his face faltered. For a split second, she saw him for what he was, a cornered animal calculating his escape. "It was a long night. We grabbed a final drink to celebrate." "You kissed her, David." The words were quiet, but they held the weight of a death sentence. "You stood under the awning, and you kissed her, like you used to kiss me." The gaslighting came next, a torrent of denials and accusations. She was being hormonal, overly emotional. Her pregnancy was making her paranoid. He was under immense pressure at work, and this was how she supported him. He was a master manipulator, twisting her own reality until she almost doubted the evidence of her own eyes. But the image was seared into her brain, a permanent scar on her memory. The fight escalated, the whispers turning to shouts that echoed through the perfect, silent house. It ended with David's cold, final declaration. "This marriage is over, Alice," he said, his face a mask of detached cruelty. "It has been for a long time." He paused, delivering the final devastating blow. And don't for a second think you're getting a free ride. That baby you're carrying. We both know the struggles we had. I want a paternity test. I'm not paying a cent in child support until I see definitive proof. The demand was so audacious, so profoundly cruel, that it shocked her into silence. After years of shared tears in fertility clinics, of holding her hand through invasive procedures, of celebrating the positive test with what she thought were genuine tears of joy, he was now using their most private pain as a weapon against her. He was not just leaving her. He was trying to erase her, to invalidate her motherhood, to sever the very biological bond that tied them together. In that moment, something inside Alice hardened. The grief was still there, a vast black ocean threatening to drown her. But beneath it, a new unyielding bedrock of resolve was forming. He wanted proof. He wanted a fight. He would get one. She would not be erased. She would walk into that courtroom with her head held high, armed with the undeniable truth of science. She would prove he was the father not for his sake, but for her child's. She would secure their future, and she would make David Hayes face the one thing he could not manipulate or deny, the simple biological truth. Or so she thought. The days that followed were a blur of cold reality. David moved out his departure as swift and efficient as a business transaction. He left behind a house that suddenly felt cavernous and hostile, every object a ghost of a shared memory. His lawyer, a piranha in a $1,000 suit named Robert Thorne, sent the first volley a divorce petition that was as brutal as it was insulting. It painted Alice as an unstable, gold-digging spouse and formally demanded a court-adjudicated DNA test to establish paternity before any discussion of child support or alimony. Alice's sister Sarah flew in from Atlanta, her presence a warm, steadying anchor in the maelstrom. It was Sarah who found Ms. Diana Finch, a family law attorney whose reputation was built on a combination of sharp legal acumen and fierce compassion. Ms. Finch's office, located in a restored historic building, was the antithesis of Robert Thorne's chrome and glass tower. It was filled with books, warm wood, and the faint scent of Earl Grey tea, a sanctuary of calm competence. "He's trying to build a narrative, Alice," Ms. Finch explained during their first meeting, her voice calm and measured as she reviewed the petition. "He wants to paint you as deceitful, to minimize his own culpability, and more importantly, his financial liability. The paternity demand is a classic ugly tactic. It's designed to humiliate you and cast doubt on your character from the outset." Alice sat stiffly, her hands protectively cradling her swollen belly. "But we went through 3 rounds of IVF, Diana. He was there. He held my hand. He signed the consent forms. It's his child. There is no question." "I believe you," Ms. Finch said, her eyes meeting Alice's with unwavering sincerity. "And we have the records from the fertility clinic, which will be crucial. But Mr. Thorne is going to argue that those records don't preclude the possibility of infidelity. It's despicable, but it's the game he'll play. So we will play our own game. We'll beat them at it." The strategy was simple. Get ahead of their demand. Ms. Finch recommended a non-invasive prenatal paternity test, NIPT. It was a cutting-edge procedure that could determine paternity with over 99% accuracy, as early as 7 weeks into pregnancy, by analyzing the fetal DNA fragments circulating in the mother's bloodstream and comparing them to a DNA sample from the potential father. "We do our own test with a reputable certified lab," Ms. Finch advised. "We get the results and we walk into that preliminary hearing with irrefutable proof. It will shut down Mr. Thorne's entire strategy before he even gets a chance to deploy it. It cuts the legs out from under his argument and shows the court that his demand is nothing more than a malicious tactic to harass a pregnant woman." The logistics were cold and clinical. A kit was sent to their respective locations. Alice went to a sterile lab, a kind nurse drawing vials of her blood. David, according to his lawyer, provided a cheek swab sample at a facility across town. The process felt deeply violating, reducing the miracle of her pregnancy to a chain of custody and a bar-coded specimen bag. Every step was a fresh reminder of David's betrayal. He wasn't just denying their history. He was attempting to scientifically sever his connection to their future. While they waited for the results, the legal battle intensified. Thorne sent discovery requests demanding years of Alice's personal financial records diaries and even correspondences with friends searching for any hint of indiscretion. He filed motions to limit her access to their joint accounts, effectively trying to starve her out. It was a war of attrition, and David, with his vast resources and Victoria's strategic mind whispering in his ear, was fighting to win at any cost. Alice spent her days surrounded by stacks of legal documents, the fine print blurring into a meaningless jumble. The seafoam green nursery, once a source of joy, now felt like a room in a stranger's house. She would sit in the rocking chair, her hand on her belly, feeling the baby move, and whisper promises to him. "I'm fighting for you," she would say, her voice thick with emotion. "No matter what he says, no matter what he does, you are wanted, and you are loved. And you are your father's son." One evening, Sarah found her weeping silently in the nursery. "This is what he wants, Alice," Sarah said, kneeling beside her and taking her hand. "He wants you to break. He and that viper Victoria are banking on you being too exhausted and too heartbroken to fight back. You can't let them win." "How can he do this?" Alice whispered the question she'd asked herself 1,000 times. "How can he look at everything we built, everything we went through to have this baby, and just try to burn it all to the ground?" "Because he's weak," Sarah said, her voice firm. "And he's being controlled by a woman who sees you and this baby as a threat to her position and his wallet. This isn't about love anymore, Alice. It's a business deal. You are a liability they are trying to mitigate." Sarah's words were harsh, but they were true. Stripped of emotion, this was a strategic battle. Understanding that gave Alice a strange sense of clarity. She wasn't just a scorned wife. She was an opponent. And she would not be underestimated. A week later, a crisp, sealed envelope arrived via courier at Ms. Finch's office. The results were in. Alice's hands trembled as Diana opened it, her own heart pounding in her ears. She knew logically what it would say. But David's campaign of psychological warfare had been so effective that a sliver of doubt, a poisonous seed, had been planted in her mind. Ms. Finch unfolded the single sheet of paper, her eyes scanning the technical jargon. A slow, relieved smile spread across her face. She turned the paper around for Alice to see. There, in bold, unambiguous print, was the conclusion: probability of paternity, 99.999%. The relief was so immense, so overwhelming that it felt like a physical weight lifting from her chest. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in weeks, they were tears not of sorrow, but of vindication. It was here. The truth printed in black and white, her weapon, her shield. "This is it," Ms. Finch said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. "This is the ball game. We'll file this with the court tomorrow. Thorne and his client won't know what hit them." Alice clutched the report to her chest, the paper crinkling in her hand. It felt like the most precious document in the world. She finally had her proof. The legal gauntlet had been grueling, but she had navigated it. Now, all that was left was to present the undeniable truth in court and watch David's web of lies fall to pieces. She pictured his face, Victoria's face, when the judge read the result. She would finally have her justice. The thought gave her a strength she hadn't felt in months. She was ready. The Charleston County Family Court was an imposing building of marble and mahogany designed to convey a sense of gravitas and unassailable authority. To Alice, it felt like a coliseum, and she was a gladiator about to face the lions. She walked through the heavy double doors with Ms. Finch by her side, her back straight, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly. The DNA test result was nestled in a crisp file folder in her lawyer's briefcase, a talisman against the impending storm. David and his lawyer, Robert Thorne, were already seated at the opposing table. David looked impeccable in a navy suit, his face a mask of detached indifference. He refused to meet her gaze, focusing instead on some distant point on the wall behind her. But it was Victoria Vance who truly took Alice's breath away. She wasn't seated in the gallery where a casual observer might sit. She was at the table right next to David, a stack of papers in front of her, as if she were part of his legal team. She wore a severe blood-red dress that stood in stark contrast to the courtroom's somber tones. She looked at Alice, and a slow, smug smile spread across her lips. It was a look of utter confidence, of someone who knew the outcome of a game before it had even begun. The sight of her so brazen and triumphant sent a hot spike of anger through Alice's veins, momentarily eclipsing her fear. This woman had not only stolen her husband, but was now attempting to orchestrate the demolition of her life in a public forum. "Her presence here is highly irregular," Ms. Finch whispered to Alice. Her eyes narrowed. "It's pure intimidation. Ignore her. Focus on the judge." Judge Harrison entered a stern, gray-haired man whose expression suggested he had seen every form of human misery and was impressed by none of it. The proceedings began with a dry recitation of case numbers and legal formalities. Mr. Thorne spoke first, his voice smooth and commanding. "Your Honor, we are here today on a simple matter of due diligence. My client, Mr. Hayes, has reason to question the paternity of the child being carried by Mrs. Hayes. Before any further discussions regarding marital assets or support, we contend that this fundamental issue must be resolved. We have therefore filed a motion to compel a court-ordered paternity test." Ms. Finch rose gracefully. "Your Honor, we find this motion to be not only unnecessary, but also a clear act of malicious litigation intended to cause distress to my client during a vulnerable time. Mr. Hayes's sudden doubts are a transparent attempt to shirk his responsibilities." She paused for effect, letting her words hang in the silent room. "However, in the interest of resolving this matter swiftly and putting an end to Mr. Hayes's baseless accusations, we have already taken the liberty of securing a DNA test." She walked to the clerk and submitted the report from the certified lab. "This is the result of a non-invasive prenatal paternity test, Your Honor, conducted by GenTrack Diagnostics, a leader in the field. It was performed last month with samples provided by both my client and Mr. Hayes. The chain of custody was impeccable." Judge Harrison took the document, his eyes scanning the page. Alice held her breath, her gaze fixed on David. His mask of indifference finally slipped. A flicker of something confusion, anxiety crossed his face. He glanced at Victoria, who gave him a subtle, reassuring shake of her head. Her smile never wavered. "The report states," Judge Harrison said, his voice booming in the quiet room, "a 99.999% probability of paternity. It seems quite conclusive, Mr. Thorne." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Thorne boomed, stepping forward, "we strongly object to the admission of this privately commissioned document. We have no way of verifying the integrity of the sample provided by Mrs. Hayes or the lab's procedures. It is for this very reason that court-ordered testing is the standard. In fact, Your Honor, we were so certain of the need for an impartial test that we commissioned one ourselves through a court-approved facility using the same samples provided for the test Mrs. Hayes has presented. A cold knot of dread formed in Alice's stomach. This was an ambush. Thorne produced his own sealed envelope with a theatrical flourish. We received the results this morning, Your Honor, and they tell a very, very different story. He handed the report to the judge. Alice watched as Judge Harrison's eyebrows furrowed. He read the document, then reread it, his expression shifting from mild impatience to genuine surprise. He looked from the paper to Alice, a hint of pity in his eyes. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said slowly, "this report from the Charleston Forensics Laboratory states that the probability of your client, David Hayes, being the biological father is 0%. The words hit Alice like a physical blow. "What?" The sound escaped her lips as a strangled gasp. "No, that's impossible. That's a lie." And then it happened. Victoria Vance laughed. It wasn't a small chuckle. It was a full, unrestrained laugh, rich with derision and triumph. The sound echoed in the silent, wood-paneled courtroom. It was the most soul-crushing sound Alice had ever heard. It was the sound of her own humiliation, her deepest truth being publicly mocked. Every head in the courtroom turned to stare at her. She felt her face burn with shame. In that moment, she was exactly what David and Victoria wanted her to be, a hysterical, deceitful woman caught in a lie. Ms. Finch was on her feet instantly. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. This is a fabrication. There must be a mistake, a tampered sample, a clerical error." "A mistake, Ms. Finch," Thorne interjected smoothly, "or an admission of the truth that my client has suspected all along. It seems Mrs. Hayes is the one who has been fabricating things." David remained silent, but he finally looked at Alice. There was no sympathy in his eyes, only a cold, hard judgment. It was the look of a man who had successfully framed an innocent person for a crime. Alice's mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. A mistake. A switched sample. Could David have paid someone off? How could two tests on the same samples produce polar opposite results? The world felt unreal, a dizzying nightmare from which she couldn't wake. Her truth, the one thing she had clung to, had been stolen and twisted into a lie. Judge Harrison banged his gavel. "Order, I will have order." He looked at the two conflicting reports in his hands, then at Alice's stricken face and Victoria's triumphant smirk. "We have two certified lab reports with diametrically opposed conclusions. This is a highly unusual situation." He looked down at Alice, and his voice softened almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Hayes, the evidence presented by the petitioner is compelling. While I note the discrepancy, the burden of proof is on you." He sighed, a man clearly frustrated by the morning's drama. "Given the contradictory nature of these documents, the court has no choice but to order a second test, a new one. Samples from both parties will be collected here today by a court-appointed phlebotomist. They will be sealed in my presence and sent to a neutral, out-of-state facility for analysis. We will reconvene when those results are available." For David and Victoria, this was a victory. They had successfully muddied the waters, transforming Alice's undeniable truth into a he said, she said circus. As the judge adjourned the hearing, Victoria leaned over and whispered something in David's ear, and he finally smiled. Alice felt a hand on her arm. It was Ms. Finch, her face grim but resolute. Alice, breathe. This is not over. I don't know what trick they just pulled, but we are going to find out. Do you hear me? This is not over. But as Alice walked out of the courtroom, the sound of Victoria's laughter still ringing in her ears, she felt like it was. She had walked in with the truth, and now she was leaving in disgrace, her credibility shattered, publicly branded as a liar and an adulteress. The whole world thought she was a fraud, and the one person who knew the truth was the man who had orchestrated her downfall. The weeks following the court hearing were the darkest of Alice's life. The public humiliation was a heavy cloak she couldn't shed. Whispers seemed to follow her everywhere, from the grocery store to her own quiet street. She felt the pitying glances, the judgmental stares. David's narrative had taken root. She was the spurned wife, trying to trap a wealthy man with a child that wasn't his. Robert Thorne had leaked details of the conflicting DNA tests to the local society columns, framing the story with a sympathetic bent toward David, the powerful man betrayed. Alice retreated into the sanctuary of her home, but even there, the silence was suffocating. Every ticking clock seemed to be counting down to her final, official ruin. She felt a profound sense of despair, a bone-deep weariness that made even the simplest tasks feel monumental. The second DNA test, the tiebreaker, felt less like an opportunity and more like a formality before her sentence was read. What if it too came back negative? What kind of sorcery were David and Victoria capable of? The doubt they had so expertly planted began to sprout toxic weeds in her mind. Ms. Finch was her only lifeline. The shrewd attorney was utterly convinced of foul play. "Judges hate this kind of circus, Alice," she said during one of their many calls. "But they are bound by evidence. Right now it's a battle of the labs. We need more than just your word. We need to find a flaw in their evidence. A crack. Something." Diana Finch was methodical. She subpoenaed every piece of paper associated with both DNA tests, lab intake forms, chain of custody documents, analyst notes, machine calibration records. For days, she and a paralegal pored over the hundreds of pages of technical data, a sea of jargon and numbers. Alice sat with them trying to help, but her mind was a fog of grief and anxiety. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a dramatic smoking gun. It was a tiny, almost insignificant detail buried deep within the paperwork from the fertility clinic documents they had acquired to prove David's participation in the IVF process. "That's odd," Ms. Finch murmured late one evening, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She was staring at an intake form from 2 years prior, from their very first IVF consultation. "What is it?" Alice asked, her voice listless. "It's David's family medical history form. He filled it out himself." She pointed to a section. "Blood type. He listed himself as O negative." "Yes, that's right," Alice confirmed. "He always said he was the universal donor. It was a point of pride for him." "Right," Diana said, her fingers drumming on the table. "But look at this." She slid one of the reports from the court-approved lab Thorne's lab across the table. It was a detailed genetic marker analysis. This lab, as part of their standard process, also determined his blood type from the DNA sample. According to this, the sample he provided is from a person with AB-positive blood. Alice stared at the two conflicting pieces of information. O negative, AB positive. They were not just different, they were genetically incompatible. A person couldn't be both. "He must have filled out the form wrong," Alice said, though the excuse sounded weak even to her own ears. A man as meticulous as your husband, Ms. Finch countered, her eyes gleaming with a renewed intensity. A man who prides himself on being a universal donor. It's possible, but it's sloppy. And David Hayes is not sloppy. She leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. What if the sample he submitted to Thorne's lab wasn't his? The implication hung in the air. Had he gotten someone else to submit a DNA sample for him, it was a possibility. It would be a bold criminal act of fraud upon the court. But the first test... Alice argued, her mind struggling to keep up. The one we ordered. It came back positive. He submitted a sample for that one, too. Why would he give a real sample to us and a fake one to his own lawyer's lab? Maybe he didn't know which lab was which, Ms. Finch mused. Maybe he thought our test was the court-ordered one and panicked. It doesn't quite add up. It's a contradiction. For the next few days, Ms. Finch was consumed by this discrepancy. The blood type anomaly was a loose thread, and she was determined to pull it until the entire tapestry of David's deception unraveled. She made a call to a trusted contact, a former medical examiner turned private investigator, and tasked him with a discreet but deep dive into David Hayes's entire medical history. Meanwhile, Ms. Finch decided on a new high-risk legal strategy. She would petition the court for something more than the standard second test. A simple repeat of the test might just yield the same confusing results if there's something more complex going on, she explained to Alice. We need to argue that given the blood type discrepancy and the conflicting results, we require a more comprehensive form of genetic testing. We need an expert to oversee it. It was a long shot. They would be asking the judge, who was already losing patience, to approve a more expensive, time-consuming process based on what could be dismissed as a simple clerical error. Thorne would paint them as desperate and delusional, throwing Hail Marys to delay the inevitable. They were back in Judge Harrison's chambers a week later. The atmosphere was tense. Thorne immediately went on the attack, accusing Ms. Finch of desperate legal theatrics and abusing the court's time and patience. Ms. Finch remained unruffled. She calmly laid out the evidence. Your Honor, we are not disputing the integrity of the labs. We are questioning the integrity of the samples. We have a medical form signed by Mr. Hayes himself, stating his blood type is O negative. The DNA sample he provided to the petitioner's chosen lab identifies the donor as AB positive. This is a fundamental biological contradiction. It suggests either a mistake of an almost impossible magnitude or, more troublingly, potential fraud. Thorne scoffed. A mistake on a 2-year-old form, Your Honor. That is the crack in the case. It's absurd. But Judge Harrison was listening. He was a stickler for detail, and the contradiction, however small, clearly bothered him. What are you proposing, Ms. Finch? The judge asked, his voice weary but curious. We propose that the court appoint a neutral third-party geneticist to oversee the next sample collection and analysis, she stated clearly. Not just a standard paternity test, but a full genetic sequencing and comparison if necessary to resolve these discrepancies once and for all. We need an expert who can explain to this court why 2 tests could yield 2 different results. We believe the truth is in the science, Your Honor, and we are simply asking for the right scientist to find it. There was a long silence as Judge Harrison considered the request. Alice held her breath, her knuckles white as she gripped the arms of her chair. This was it. If he said no, their fight was over. Mr. Thorne, the judge said, turning to David's lawyer, your client wants the truth. Ms. Finch is proposing a method to find it definitively. Do you have an objection to ensuring the utmost scientific rigor is applied? Thorne was cornered, was To object would make his client look like he had something to hide. He exchanged a quick, tense glance with David. Victoria, sitting just behind the bar this time, gave a barely perceptible shake of her head, her confident facade showing its first hairline crack. "No, Your Honor," Thorne said through gritted teeth. "We have no objection. My client is confident in the truth and welcomes any and all scrutiny." Judge Harrison nodded. "Very well. The motion is granted. I will appoint Dr. Miles Bennett, head of medical genetics at Johns Hopkins, to oversee the process. His findings will be presented to this court, and they will be considered final. We will all get to the bottom of this." As they left the chambers, Alice felt a fragile, unfamiliar feeling rise within her, a glimmer of hope. They had their expert. They had their fighting chance. Ms. Finch had found the crack, and now they were about to bring in a sledgehammer. She still didn't understand what was happening, or what David's game was, but for the first time she felt they were no longer playing on his field. They were about to change the rules of the game entirely. Dr. Miles Bennett was a man who seemed to exist in a world of quiet, intellectual certainty. He had kind eyes, a neatly trimmed gray beard, and an air of academic calm that was instantly reassuring. He met with Alice and Ms. Finch in a small private conference room at the courthouse, his presence a stark contrast to the aggressive posturing they had grown accustomed to. He spoke not in legal jargon, but in the precise, fascinating language of genetics. "This is a most unusual case," he began after reviewing the file containing the 2 contradictory DNA reports and the fertility clinic records. 2 top-tier labs using the same industry-standard STR marker analysis on samples supposedly from the same 2 people yielding results that are polar opposites. It's a statistical unicorn. He first addressed the most obvious theory. Sample fraud is, of course, a possibility, Dr. Bennett said, looking at Alice with empathy. It's not unheard of for an individual to have someone else submit a sample on their behalf. The blood type discrepancy between the clinic form and the second lab report certainly points a finger in that direction. So David had someone with AB-positive blood submit a sample for him, Ms. Finch summarized. But that still doesn't explain our first test, the test that showed he was the father. He must have given his own sample for that one. Precisely, Dr. Bennett agreed. Why would a man intent on fraud provide one legitimate sample and one fraudulent one? It's illogical. It suggests a lack of a coherent plan, which seems out of character for the man described in these files. He tented his fingers, his gaze distant. So we must consider a less common but scientifically plausible alternative. We must entertain this possibility that both lab reports are in their own way correct. Alice and Ms. Finch exchanged a look of bewilderment. "How can they both be correct?" Alice asked. "One says he is the father and one says he isn't." "Let's go back to the beginning," Dr. Bennett said, gently turning his attention to Alice. "Tell me about your IVF journey. Everything you can remember." Alice recounted the painful, hopeful process, the hormone injections, the egg retrieval, and the embryo transfer. She described the clinic, the doctors, and David's role. He had been supportive, she recalled, but also strangely detached at times. She had chalked it up to his discomfort with medical procedures. "He provided his sample at the clinic for the fertilization," Alice confirmed. "I was there. He went into a room and he came out. It was his." Dr. Bennett leaned forward, his focus intense. "And the samples for the 2 paternity tests. The first one for GenTrack was a cheek swab he did at home and mailed in correct." "Yes," Ms. Finch confirmed. "And the second one for the Charleston Forensics Lab was also a cheek swab administered at their facility." "Correct." "And the blood type discrepancy," Dr. Bennett murmured almost to himself. "O negative on a form from years ago, AB positive from the recent cheek swab." He paused, looking directly at Alice. "Mrs. Hayes, has your husband ever had a major medical procedure? A blood transfusion, an organ transplant, specifically a bone marrow transplant?" Alice searched her memory. "No, nothing like that. He's always been very healthy. He broke his leg skiing once years ago. That's it." Dr. Bennett stood up and began to pace the small room, his mind clearly working through a complex puzzle. "There is a rare biological condition," he began, "known as chimerism." He explained it in clear, simple terms. A chimera is an organism that contains cells from two or more different individuals, meaning they have two sets of DNA. It can happen in a few ways, most commonly when a woman is pregnant with fraternal twins, and one embryo perishes very early on, and its cells are absorbed by the surviving twin. That surviving person can then carry two distinct cell lines and two distinct DNA profiles for the rest of their life. "So," he continued, "it is theoretically possible for a man to have one DNA profile in his blood and saliva, the cells that would come from a cheek swab, and a completely different DNA profile in other tissues, including his reproductive organs." The room fell silent as the implication of his words settled. "You're saying," Ms. Finch began slowly, her eyes wide with understanding, "that the DNA in David's saliva could be from his absorbed twin, making it seem like he's not the father, while his reproductive cells carry his own original DNA, which he passed on to his child," Dr. Bennett finished. "The IVF procedure used the sperm cells which would carry the correct paternal DNA. The cheek swabs used for the paternity tests used his saliva cells which would carry the other DNA. It would explain everything. It was a staggering concept, something from a science fiction novel, yet Dr. Bennett presented it as a simple, if rare, biological fact. The cheek swab tests would truthfully report that the DNA profile they analyzed is not a match to the child, Dr. Bennett elaborated. They wouldn't be wrong. They would just be testing the wrong part of him. The blood type discrepancy also fits. His O-negative blood type could be his primary one, the one on his medical records, while his saliva and other tissues could carry the AB-positive profile from the secondary cell line. Alice felt a wave of dizziness. It was all so complex, so bizarre, and yet it made a terrifying kind of sense. It was the only theory that accounted for every contradictory piece of evidence. David wasn't just a liar, his own body was a lie. But a crucial question remained. "Does David know about this?" Alice asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Could he have this condition and not be aware of it?" "It's possible," Dr. Bennett conceded. "Many chimeras live their entire lives without knowing. The condition is often only discovered by accident through exactly this kind of paternity dispute or pre-transplant testing." "But it doesn't feel like an accident," Ms. Finch said, her voice hard as steel. Victoria's confidence in that courtroom, David's cold certainty. They knew that second test would come back negative. They were counting on it. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture of deception so profound it was almost psychopathic. David must have discovered his chimerism at some point, maybe during an early medical screening for the IVF process itself that he had hidden from her. He knew a standard paternity test from a cheek swab would prove he wasn't the father. It was the perfect weapon. A scientifically backed lie. He could let Alice get pregnant via IVF, knowing he had a biological escape hatch all along. He had given his real sample for their private test, likely in a moment of panic or confusion, not realizing its purpose, leading to the 99.9% match. But when his lawyer arranged for the second test, the the one they planned to use as their bombshell in court. He knew exactly what to do. He provided the cheek swab, confident the result would be 0. He and Victoria hadn't just anticipated the negative result. They had engineered the entire situation around it. Victoria's laughter in the courtroom wasn't just smugness. It was the giddy triumph of a plan perfectly executed. "He used his own biology to frame me," Alice said, the horror of it washing over her. "Yes," Dr. Bennett said softly. "It appears he did." "So how do we prove it?" Ms. Finch asked, her legal mind already racing ahead. "What's the definitive test?" "We can't use his saliva or his blood," Dr. Bennett explained. "We need to test tissue that is likely to only contain his primary cell line. A skin biopsy would work. Or more simply, we can test his parents if they are available. Their DNA would show they are the grandparents of your child, which would by extension prove that their son is the father, regardless of what his cheek swab says. But the most direct route, we test the source. We need a new sample from Mr. Hayes, but not a cheek swab. We need the same kind of sample he provided to the fertility clinic." The room was quiet for a moment. "We need a court-ordered semen sample," Ms. Finch stated the words hanging in the air. It was an unprecedented, deeply invasive request. But it was the only way to expose the truth that was hiding in David's own cells. Alice felt a cold resolve settle over her. The fight was no longer just about child support or her reputation. It was about revealing a deception so monstrous, so fundamentally twisted, that it had to be brought into the light. David Hayes had used science as his shield. Now they would use it as their sword. The final court hearing felt like the world premiere of a play for which only Alice's side knew the shocking final act. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Robert Thorne and David Hayes sat at their table, exuding an air of weary confidence, as if they were there to finalize an already won battle. Victoria Vance was back seated in the front row of the gallery, her posture perfect, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. She looked like a queen surveying her victory. Judge Harrison entered his face, an unreadable mask of judicial neutrality. "We are here to hear the findings of the court-appointed expert, Dr. Miles Bennett, regarding the paternity of the child of Mrs. Hayes. Dr. Bennett, you may proceed." Dr. Bennett walked to the witness stand carrying a single thin file. He was sworn in and began to speak, his voice calm and authoritative, a lecturer addressing a captivated class. He started by validating both of the previous DNA reports. "Your Honor," he began, "my investigation concludes that neither Gentrack Diagnostics nor the Charleston Forensics Laboratory made an error. Based on the samples they were given, standard buccal swabs, their conclusions were scientifically sound. Gentrack received a sample that was a 99.999% match. Charleston Forensics received a sample that was a 0% match." Robert Thorne leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk on his face. This was going exactly as he'd planned. "However," Dr. Bennett continued, "the discrepancy is not due to lab error or sample tampering in the conventional sense. It is due to a rare biological condition possessed by Mr. David Hayes. Mr. Hayes is a tetragametic chimera." A ripple of confusion went through the courtroom. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "In English, please, Doctor." "Certainly, Your Honor." Dr. Bennett then gave the same clear, concise explanation he had given to Alice and Ms. Finch. He explained how a person could carry two distinct sets of DNA. He used simple analogies, speaking of two separate instruction manuals existing within one person. Mr. Hayes's saliva and some of his other tissues, including the sample he provided for the second test, carry the DNA of a fraternal twin brother who was absorbed in the womb. His reproductive cells, however, carry his own distinct DNA profile. Thorne was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is speculative science fiction. There is no proof of this fantastical condition." "On the contrary, Mr. Thorne," Dr. Bennett said calmly, before the judge could even rule. "There is definitive proof." Ms. Finch stood. "Your Honor, pursuant to Dr. Bennett's recommendation, we filed a motion to compel Mr. Hayes to provide a sample identical in nature to the one he provided for the successful IVF treatment. You granted that motion last week under seal." David's face went pale. He shot a panicked look at Thorne, who seemed genuinely caught off guard. Victoria's smile faltered for the first time. "A new sample was collected from Mr. Hayes by Dr. Bennett himself," Ms. Finch continued. "That sample was analyzed, and its DNA was compared to that of the unborn child." Dr. Bennett opened his file. "The DNA from Mr. Hayes's germline cells. His sperm is a completely different profile from the DNA in his saliva. And the germline DNA is a 99.999% match to the fetus. David Hayes is with absolute scientific certainty the biological father of Mrs. Hayes's child." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was as if the world had stopped spinning. Then chaos. Thorne began sputtering objections, calling the entire proceeding a circus and an invasion of his client's privacy. But the damage was done. The lie, so carefully constructed, so audacious in its scope, had been shattered by a truth even stranger than fiction. Judge Harrison stared at David, a look of profound disgust on his face. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice dangerously low, "did you have prior knowledge of this condition?" David, cornered and exposed, seemed to shrink in his chair. He stammered, I don't... It's a medical thing I didn't understand." But Ms. Finch was not finished. "We have more, Your Honor." She produced another document. "This is a record from a preliminary genetic screening Mr. Hayes underwent a year and a half ago at a private clinic in Atlanta, 6 months before the IVF process began. He told my client it was for a life insurance policy. This report clearly identifies his chimerism. It explicitly warns that standard paternity tests using blood or saliva would likely yield a negative result. He knew. He has known all along." The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place. This was not an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a premeditated, calculated fraud. He had knowingly entered into the IVF process with his wife, all while holding a get-out-of-jail-free card, a biological trump card he planned to play to abandon her and their child. Victoria Vance looked as if she had been struck by lightning. Her face was a mask of utter shock and horror. The plan which she had thought was so clever was not just a failure. It was a public spectacle of their own monstrous deception. The smug laughter she had directed at Alice now seemed like a grotesque prelude to her own downfall. She stared at David not with love or support, but with the dawning, furious realization that his web of lies was far more complex than she had ever imagined, and she was now caught in it with him. Judge Harrison banged his gavel, his face a thundercloud of fury. "Mr. Hayes, Mr. Thorne, I suggest you sit down before I hold you both in contempt. Of all the cynical, manipulative, and cruel tactics I have seen in my 20 years on this bench, this is by far the most reprehensible. To use one's own unique biology as a tool for such a profound and calculated deceit against one's wife and unborn child is beyond the pale." He looked at the evidence, then at Alice, his expression softening for the first time into one of deep respect and sympathy. The court finds the expert testimony of Dr. Bennett to be conclusive. He declared, his voice ringing with finality. Paternity is established. Mr. David Hayes is the legal and biological father. All motions by the petitioner are dismissed. I will be ruling in favor of Mrs. Hayes on all matters of support, and I can assure you, Ms. Finch, I will be taking Mr. Hayes's egregious conduct into severe consideration when determining the final settlement. His attempt to commit fraud upon this court will be dealt with separately and with the appropriate gravity. He banged the gavel one last time. This hearing is adjourned. It was over. Alice sat stunned, the wave of vindication so powerful it left her breathless. Ms. Finch squeezed her hand, her own eyes shining with triumph. Across the room, David Hayes sat with his head in his hands, a broken man, his intricate deception dismantled piece by piece in front of the world. Victoria stood up abruptly and walked out of the courtroom without a single backward glance, her face a mask of cold fury. The partnership, it seemed, was dissolved. Alice had walked into the legal battle armed with a simple truth. She had been met with a lie so complex it was woven into her husband's very DNA. But in the end, the full, unvarnished, and bizarre truth had come out, and it had set her free. The aftermath of the verdict was swift and brutal for David Hayes. The court awarded Alice a settlement that reflected the depth of his deception, giving her the house significant support and financial security. His attempt to commit fraud led to a criminal investigation, and the public scandal cost him his career and his partnership with Victoria, which dissolved into bitter accusations. The empire he and his mistress had planned was now rubble, and he became a pariah in the city he once commanded. For Alice, victory tasted of peace. She reclaimed her home and her life, finding strength in her hard-won independence. A few weeks later, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy, naming him Ethan, a name that meant strong. Holding him for the first time, she felt a love so fierce it erased the shadows of the past. Her life found a new, quiet rhythm, filled with the simple joys of motherhood and a slow return to her own career. David was a footnote in her story now. No longer a prisoner in a gilded cage, Alice was a free woman, embracing a new dawn she had won for herself and her son. Alice's story is a powerful reminder that the fight for truth is often a fight for one's own sanity. It wasn't just about a courtroom battle. It was about reclaiming her narrative from the gaslighting and profound deceit of the two people she should have been able to trust the most. She faced public humiliation and impossible odds, armed with nothing but a mother's instinct and the courage to demand answers when the science itself seemed to lie. Her victory was not just legal, but personal, a reclamation of her dignity and her strength. The incredible twist of genetic chimerism shows that sometimes reality is far stranger and more complex than any fiction. What do you think you would have done in her position? Could you have been as resilient as Alice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If her incredible story of courage and resilience moved you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to see the power of perseverance, and don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable true stories that prove the truth is always worth fighting for.